Welcome to the Genre Hustle, your virtual sci-fi fantasy writers group. I'm Anton.
I'm Chris.
I'm Lucy.
I'm Chelsea.
And I'm AP.
And today we are talking about what you do after you've written your first draft. And I'm going to use a term that one of my writing instructors used. He called it the spaghetti draft because this is the draft that looks like a giant plate of spaghetti. You've written it. It's just a bunch of words sitting out there. And now what do you do?
You can also substitute vomit for spaghetti if you prefer.
Yeah, I was going to say that's more positive than what I call my first draft.
Yeah.
Same.
Wow. I mean, we've also
spaghetti.
called it NaNo drafts, and we've just finished Camp NaNo, so I know a lot of you out there have a spaghetti draft or a NaNo draft,
Right. You've
Or
got
vomit draft.
an exploratory draft.
Whoa,
So
that's a
we're
very scientific
very
term.
well.
I call
so
it the
positive.
bad draft.
It's crap is what it is.
Yeah.
Pile
generally,
of crap
with a
draft.
little tiny nugget, hopefully, of something awesome.
But let's acknowledge that you have completed something. You've got 50,000 words or 70,000 words or
It's a big deal.
700,000
Yeah, first
words
off,
or
that's
whatever.
amazing.
Cheers to you, first of all, because that's a lot of work. It's really hard to do.
Right.
And
hard,
it's
yeah.
more than most people will actually do.
Right.
Absolutely.
To actually
Yeah,
finish it.
you wrote a novel. You did it.
Yeah.
Now we're going to help you do way better.
Right.
Hopefully.
So let's just go around here and just kind of identify some of the terms. What is it that is in this story? So you've got something like you've got your character arcs. You've got your main story points. You want to make sure you've got structure. Does it have 3 acts?
I mean, these are all things that you might not even think about or have in your first draft.
Well,
so
so
we're
let-
here to talk about those.
Yeah. So real quickly, let's touch on the first draft stuff. Hopefully at the end of the first draft, for me, I like to at least have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It doesn't necessarily have to be balanced. It doesn't necessarily have to make complete linear sense, but I like to know where I'm starting, where I'm going to end up, and hopefully have some sort of balance in the middle. Doesn't necessarily have to work yet, but there's like a lump of raw clay.
But I think what we're kind of getting at here is that you've got to read that first draft.
Oh, yeah.
That I think is one of the most important things. Let it sit for a minute. Don't write the end and then flip back to page 1 and read it.
Don't finish on Sunday and start reading it again on Monday.
No, let it sit and hang out there for a second. Take a break from it.
Good
and
advice.
then come back to it. And then, just like you were saying, Anton, start looking at these huge 5 points.
Right.
So before we get to those
in
5
an
points,
analytical way.
I mean, you said let it sit, and I think we've all heard that advice, but I've heard anything from 2 days to 6 months. I mean,
Well,
what?
I think
So-
6 months is too long.
I think
Yeah.
2 days is too short.
Okay.
All right, well,
between
we've
that.
defined the endpoints. That's good.
All right.
I
Well-
think 2 weeks is good, personally.
2 weeks sounds about right to me. I think it's just one of those things where you want to let it breathe for a minute
You
and
want to let
maybe
yourself breathe too.
go to the mall, buy a smoothie. I don't know.
Hey, they have this thing called Amazon now, Chris.
Like-
Get an orange Julius.
This might be a good time to
Play some Space Invaders.
read a book that's outside of your genre so that
Totally.
you can kind of recalibrate your reader eyes.
Good idea.
Take in some movies and stuff. That way you can like recenter yourself in the creative process, get re-excited again about creativity because, writing can be trying. It's not always like,
Your
rainbows
brain
and
is
sunshine.
a muscle. It's a muscle.
Yeah, it's a muscle. And so, take that break, recalibrate.
rest.
That way you can come back to your first draft with the eyes of a reader.
And if you don't want to disconnect completely from the creative process, something I've done is I've actually worked on a short story after finishing.
Yeah,
It's a nice
draft.
palate
It's-
cleanser.
Switch gears.
Yeah,
somewhere.
it's just something totally different, but you're still working, so it's semi-work.
Chelsea reminded me, I just had it. I think you should wait long enough where you've forgotten the story so that the whole point is to come back to it
Okay.
fresh. So for me to forget something takes about an hour.
Right.
So
Some of us that might not work.
yeah,
Sometimes
some people can retain things a lot longer, I've heard. So
yeah. Well, so should we talk about what?
right. So you've done this inventory, you've gone
Right.
through, right? And now the trick is you're coming back to it and you want to look for what is missing. And so Lucy, you said there's kind of 5 points, and let's just settle this right now. These are not definitive. These are sort
So
of
yeah, this is just us sort of like talking about the doing your second draft. And these are some points
Yeah.
that we came up with that we think are good places to start.
Right. These are the major problems that you should be looking for. Number one is structural.
Well, let's just talk about that.
Okay.
Talk about each one.
So structural it means a couple different things, but generally it's, do you have a 3-act structure? Do you have a, first act, second act, third act? Do you have a midpoint? Do you have a climax at the end of your second act going into the third act? Do you have...
Well, and I think more importantly than knowing that you have each of the major structural points is making sure that they're coherent. Because, like, I know my first completed draft, I had all those things and they weren't coherent.
That was my problem exactly, too.
Yeah.
When I was doing The Secret in the Ice, the novel that I was working on before I decided I didn't want to write a novel was, I realized I had these giant structural problems, whereas it's a portal fiction, so the hero goes through the portal, and then I was sort of, okay, well, now what? And then I had an ending. I knew how I wanted to get them back, but I had 2/3 of a book that I didn't know what they were doing.
Right. But so this is the point. So you have your first draft, you may have some stuff in there that works, and you may have some stuff that doesn't. This is the time, I think as Lucy said off mic, if you don't have the structure in place, if you don't have the foundation of the house in place, at this point, any other stuff you're going to work on is you're sort of spinning your wheels, because you need to have at least a good solid, you don't have to have it perfect in the second draft or whatever, but like you should have an idea and a good solid structure to build upon when you start doing other
Absolutely.
things.
I think logic is a good word to use. I always think about it that way. Is this a logical piece of writing? Is this a logical story? So when I'm reading it, are there a bunch of storylines that go nowhere? That's a really common problem. Do I set up a bunch of things that I just drop in the middle?
Right.
Or is it a logical story in which everything that I have set up pays off at the end, and I can believe, within reason, because we're talking about fantasy and sci-fi, but I can believe this story.
Yeah.
And I think those are really important questions to be
And I think
asking yourself.
the important distinction there is, this is plot, not story. This is A to B to C. Your character he starts at this point, they get on an airplane, they land in this country, and then they go and meet with the captain, and then they do A to B to C. It's not how are they feeling. It's not what's going on. It is what's going on. It's not the emotional part.
All that stuff will be in there, but you don't want to focus or get too
that's my point. Yeah.
bogged down on that stuff until you have the basic structure.
Yeah, you don't want to write a bunch of scenes and then you realize your structure's a mess and you have to delete them all.
Which we've all done.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
yeah.
so so that leads us into, I think once you have if you have a good solid structure, then maybe it's time to start looking at the character arcs. Okay, and making sure that the characters have agency. So like,
Explain agency real quick.
that your character has a reason for doing the things that they're doing, that they are proactive, that they're not just sort of like bouncing around like a ping pong ball.
They have wants and
Yeah.
needs and they're acting
Well,
on
and you
them.
want the character to drive the story and drive their own choices, not like, basically you want the character to go into the burning building because it is in their nature to do so, or they have a plot centric reason like why they want to do it, not because the plot is telling them to do it.
Right. Well, so for example, I had in my first novel, after my first, actually, I wish it was just after the first draft. It was after the first
It's a learning process.
Plus, so I had a major character who had some POV chapters and stuff, and the feedback I started getting was that like, Sarah doesn't really she doesn't want anything. She just kind of, so she gets kidnapped.
She was the princess in your castle.
Yeah, she was in the castle. She gets kidnapped. She gets rescued. Blah. Okay. So one of the things that I did
I would
after
drop that third part.
yeah. So one of the things I had to do was figure out what is, I had this with some of the other characters, but I was like, what does Sarah want? How is she going to go about getting it? And how is she going to grow and change? Because she basically was the same character at the beginning and at the end.
Right.
So that's the next step. I think after starts, you can start looking
Yeah.
at that stuff.
Because
Doesn't
they
do
have
much-
their own structure. So once you've got the main story structure down, then you do that same kind of progression and structure for each character.
Absolutely. And again, your mileage may vary. This is This is what we've decided.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but a nice thing to do might say like, so look at your outline, look at the structure and say, okay, so how is the inciting incident going to affect this character? What is this character's emotional midpoint? What is this character's emotional climax? And try to link those up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think that is why people read. They read because of the reactions to events, not necessarily the events themselves.
Oh, absolutely.
And the way and their interpersonal relationships with the other people around them. So once you know that the gate is locked and the characters need to get inside, that in itself is not a particularly interesting, that's plot. That's the kind of stuff that's coming out in the first draft. The interesting thing is how they get inside the gate and the little arguments that break out around it, or the ego war that's coming, and what we learn about people and being humans from that. And that is all the cool stuff that I think you get to write in the
No, that's a great point.
draft.
Well, yeah, and character arc and character agency should be interlinked. Because the emotional reactions of those characters, like the gate is locked, and so now what am I gonna do? Like your rogue is gonna do something different than your warrior, and how each of those guys reacts is gonna feed into the conflict.
Yeah, and actually conflict is the next big point that we wanted to talk about. Once you're at a point where you feel like your plot's good, your character arcs are good, maybe start thinking about the conflict. You want to make sure that everything that's happening in the draft you just wrote or the next draft that you're going to write, there's always conflict. You don't have parts where you're just kind of like lagging around or people are just walking from point A to point B. You've already determined what your character's agency is, so start giving it conflict and driving the story with it.
And the conflict, I'm going to say, it's so important. It needs to be immediate and present. So it needs to actually matter to the protagonist.
Yeah.
Like if the king is assassinated, it's not going to matter to your like John Everyman living in the village.
Or find a way for it to matter
Yeah.
to him. Like
Yeah,
there are
make
tax
it-
collectors that are coming that are different now because
Yeah,
of the-
exactly. Make it matter. So I'm not convinced by somebody who's like, oh, the king is dead. What will I do now? I am, I am impressed with somebody who's like, tax collectors are coming. Guess I better form a militia. Like,
Yeah,
make
I
it
gotta
matter.
repaint the colors on my house because the old king wanted these colors or
Yeah,
something.
Make it matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think you hit it, Chelsea, too, is there's different levels to the conflict. There's the big conflict. There's what's the story all about conflict, and all the way down to the micro level, the little dramas, the how do they get into the gate? Where did I leave my keys? Why doesn't my mother call me back? All the little dramas.
Well,
Yeah.
Anton.
I know, right? I know. A little too close to home, right?
The most important thing is that there's conflict of some kind in every scene, in every chapter.
Yes.
Because if there's not, and your characters are moving through the story with no conflict, against them, you will be bored and your reader will be instantly bored because there's no uphill
absolutely, yeah.
struggle.
So
anymore.
I think I have like a little bit of a warning. Don't mistake characters arguing for conflict. That's not the same.
I mean, it can be the same.
It can be, but like, don't like. I would say like, don't just have your characters kind of start bitching at each other, and
like I want Thai food. No.
Yeah, like to make it
Right.
to make a chapter more interesting if it doesn't really matter.
It's not
Yeah.
the same as a domestic dispute. Conflict is the thing that is getting in the way of the
Yes.
main character or a character's point of view
Right.
getting what they want. They want something, and the conflict is the thing in the way,
Right.
even if it's themselves.
And it actually reminds me of a previous episode, what Marissa said. One of the main things she sees as an editor going wrong with writers is that there are scenes that happen where you're just being too easy on your main character. So it's like they should always, like you said, Lucy, every scene should have something for the character to push against and to fight against. Otherwise, it's just boring. And so when you're doing your second draft going through, those are the places where you kind of see, oh, this chapter or this scene doesn't have any conflict. Maybe this is one that's going to get cut.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You start making
Or
those
what
decisions.
conflict can I inject here?
Either way, but yeah.
Yeah.
Or do they get into the gate too easily? And that goes back to my logic argument.
Right.
I won't believe that they just suddenly come up with the password out of nowhere without,
They have to work for it.
they
Yeah,
have
you
to work for it,
yeah.
and that's logic. We
Yeah.
that logic resonates with us as people. We're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I will give them this.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about theme when you're reading through your first draft and looking for areas that you can work in theme. And I think that all that really means is, what is the book about? What am I saying in a bigger sense here? Yes, okay, the story is about a group of people getting into a gate, but what is it? What am I saying about the
whole
world
book is
and
about them
about
getting
the
into the
human
gate.
experience?
I can't wait to read this one.
That's a real page turner.
It's my gate book. Just wait for it.
There are
It's coming out
several
next summer.
gates.
Exactly. It's the first in a trilogy.
Book 2 is called The Courtyard.
But personally, I think it's a major mistake to write to theme. So don't,
I agree.
you can tell instantly if you want to write about, these ideals and you write the first draft based on that. Don't do that. Write a story. So you've got your story,
Yes.
you've got your plot, and then read through your story and look for commonalities in the story. So, for example, I wanted to write this little story about a magical coin. And I had no idea what the story was about. I just thought it was a good idea. So I wrote the story. And the first draft itself went very, very quickly. It only took a few months. And the coin itself created these amazing experiences for the user. But the downside of using it was that it stole time. So it can make, an hour feel like a minute. It can make 7 days feel like an hour. And that's the penance that you pay for using this coin. So it's a bit like drugs in a way. And when I read that back, I'm like, okay, I guess this is kind of about time. When these people use this coin, they spend all their time. Their time is kind of eaten up by this sort of insidious evil magic. And so I'm like, okay, so I guess time is a big theme in this book. So going through and writing a second draft, I looked for opportunities in which I could talk about time and the way that characters relate to time. I suddenly realized that there were lots of clocks, and the presence of
People are checking
clocks
their watches.
were important. Yeah,
Watching
exactly.
trains.
So I managed to write in this little watch device to the last, like a golden watch, and that became really important. So just looking for areas that you can make the whole story harmonious and start to comment on stuff, about how important time is and how easy it is to waste. And that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm trying to say, I guess, is as a writer in a bigger sense.
So I actually want to not really disagree,
Sure.
but to the point of if you have a theme that you want to write to, I think that's fine. I don't think I've ever done that, and I think that's pretty hard to do. But if you're doing that, I think there's a lot of themes that people do want to talk about. Maybe they have something in their mind that's something that's going on politically right now, or it's in the zeitgeist. It's okay to have that in your mind when you're writing the first draft or the second draft, but just be sure that it, like you said, it does have a story. Don't just write something because you want to write about a theme. That's why we talked about the first point of this is structure. You want to have a complete story.
Well, that's what I was saying. Otherwise, I think then you end up with these kind of preachy pieces of writing.
dry.
That it's like a moral lesson sort of thing. Yeah.
Or it's an op-ed, or it's just not a novel.
Fables just aren't in fashion anymore.
But even fables have some story structure.
Yeah, they
to
do.
them. Yeah.
Well, but I think the point is that, for me, listening to you talk about that really resonates for me because I never know what the hell I'm writing about. I am just writing a story. I know there's something deeper going on whenever I'm writing something, but I have no idea what it is until later drafts. And that's when you start to recognize those things, like what you're talking about with the pulling in those little thematic touches. That's the best part of writing. That's when you have gotten to a point where you have your structure in place, you have these characters, and then you're putting on the frosting. You're starting to do that a little bit in the second draft. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think I'll take it even one step further. Because it's fantasy and sci-fi, it gets dinged for not having theme or having too much theme. If you think about, some early sci-fi stuff is these overarching themes and these big ideas sort of housed in science fiction.
That's a whole nother argument.
That's a whole other podcast.
I'm prepared to have with you
No,
right
I know.
now.
I wish you were sitting this one out so we wouldn't have to. But my point is that to Lucy's point is that I think when you got to your first draft, I think you want to be looking for this stuff because we're going to talk about pantsing versus plotters in a second. But if you're one of these people that just sits down and just writes down 50,000 words, something's going to come out that you may not have thought about.
Exactly, yeah.
And so I think maybe this is kind of to your point, Lucy, is when you're going through this, you want to be able to pull that out. You want to see those nuggets of gold in your pan there as you're sifting and be able to identify that and go, oh, this story is really about this. Okay, now as I'm reading through it, great. Let me make sure that I remember that, because that's the character is really, in screenwriting, they talk about want versus need. This is the want. Okay, but what do they need? And just maybe to your point, Chris, is like that's in the second draft, you sort of like, okay, now I'm going to really lay that in. But I think, Lucy, you're right. You have to be able to identify that.
Yeah. And I think that if I had gone the other way and I had said, okay, I want to write a book about how precious time is and how we all waste time, I would have run the risk of creating two-dimensional characters, because there would have been a father who never spent time with his daughter. And that's not real. People are three-dimensional, and they have good and bad sides. And that, I think that's always the problem that I find when people write to theme, is that everything becomes about the theme and you forget to just write a story.
And I think people can do that. I personally can't. I'm in the Chris camp that I write these books and hope that something is there that it's about.
I mean, I suspect that like if we sat down and like came up with a list of books where like that's a book that talks about this theme, and what I suspect that it all came out the way that Lucy is describing.
I think so,
which is that people wrote a story, and even in the end, if it appears like, wow, they're really on point on this, it's
because they're great writers.
Yeah,
and it's also several drafts
because they did several drafts.
Yeah, exactly.
They didn't come out
doing
the
this
first
a long time. Yeah,
that the
you don't
spaghetti
read first drafts.
Yeah, draft. So.
Well, yeah, and some themes I think can just be organic to character development and structure, like overcoming challenges, and that's a little heavy-handed as a theme and like really, really broad, but you can work with that in like disability, for instance, if you have a disabled character now, and that's just gonna be something that arises organically out of the process, or like relationships between mothers and daughters or fathers and sons. Those are really big themes, and it's baked into your character development.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's really accurate, because I think just in the nature of the story that you're telling, you're going to be able to find themes within it. Stephen King talks a lot about this in his book on writing. When he wrote Carrie, he said, I didn't mean to write, blood wasn't a major theme, but just by the nature of the story that I was telling, all of a sudden I realized it's about this girl and the period that she's going through in her life. There was just blood in the book, and I started to pull that out and make that into a major, violence and blood became major themes. So it's exactly like you say. It can just be, look for what you have already there on the page.
And that is part of the fun of the discovery. You're like, oh, I wrote this book about that. Oh, that makes total sense. Like,
so what you're saying is Stephen King agrees with us.
Yes, exactly.
Great. Perfect.
He always
You
does.
read it here first.
despite how many times we knock him on this.
When have we ever knocked Stephen
I think
King?
I've done it. I know I've done it at least twice.
Anton.
So I think the last area that we discussed was pacing, and we kind of touched on it earlier with conflict, and that each scene needs to be kind of conflict oriented.
Right.
And so to me, like when I was writing Taromancer, my first draft, because it's first person and like an extremely close first person, it was very easy for me to get bogged down in a lot of details and just getting Beth like from place to place, and like her getting food or like just doing different things. And so now, and I think I have like 4 gearing up scenes in the first novel. And I love a good gearing up scene, but you do not need that many of them. And so like this is also the time where you can kind of cut the chaff a little bit and like look for the scenes that aren't producing echoes in the rest of the book. Like if the book is not going to be impacted, if you remove the scene, you can take out the scene.
Right. I'll quote Lucy from before we were on mic, which is, if you're bored reading the scene, your reader is going to be bored too.
Most likely.
Which is so devistating. You read your own writing, and
and you're like, what am I talking about?
bored with myself.
Yeah. That's what pacing is the story. If it's, and people talk about this all the time, where if a story is not a page turner, there's page turners and there's a page turner. Not everything has to be, this pot boiler. Or it's
it doesn't necessarily mean a fast-paced story doesn't necessarily mean there has to be like a car chase around every corner.
Right.
But you do need to have forward momentum throughout the book.
That's it. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think that, like, again, that is really obvious when you go back and read your first draft. The places where, like,
You're so in love with this scene.
I know, like Chelsea had gearing up scenes. I have usually in a first draft 7 to 8
Coffee scenes.
ordering coffee scenes. Yeah. So, and those get chopped out in draft number 2. Most of them.
You do love yourself a good coffee shop scene.
I do.
Okay, so we've gone through this inventory. We've gone through these top 5 major problems. So now let's give our listeners some ideas, some tips and tricks, and what they can do to kind of help them through. And you had a good one, Chris.
Well, so AP and I talk about this a lot, outlining. So not
Or
every
re-outlining even.
re-outlining. So my personal experience has been this, where, like, I wrote a first novel, didn't outline it all, mess. Okay. My current work in progress, I have done 5 different outlines. So I had a basic outline. I wrote the first draft, just had it in my head. When I went back to the second draft, I made an outline, and I was like, I have all the points. Here's my inciting incident. Here's my break into 2. Here's blah, blah, blah. As I wrote, I continued to refine it. So, but for what I've discovered is that by paying attention to that structural stuff and also being flexible with it, like, if you have your outline, doesn't mean you have to write to that outline if you go off in a different tangent.
And you often don't.
I personally have never stuck to an early outline, but, like, what it enables you to do is save years of your life. Okay. Like, if you can get to that point, like, for me, like, learning how, really studying structure, 3-act structure, and kind of understanding it, for me, has made an amazing difference in how productive I can be as a writer.
Because you're then able to see your writing and understand, oh, I'm coming in too late, or I'm coming in too early, or this happens too much.
Yeah. So if you're a super genius and you don't need an, like, structure, and you can break the structure and make a compelling story, that's great. I'm not. I have found that if by paying attention to these things, my stories automatically flow better, they feel better, and they work better. But, your mileage may vary on that. So,
well, and that goes to kind of another tip or trick. And this is, AP, you mentioned at the top that for those of you who just finished Camp NaNoWriMo, we talk a lot, or we don't talk a lot, but pantsing versus plotters, those who write by the seat of their pants versus those who sort of outline their story to death. And I think if you've written, no matter what, you've written this first draft, whether you just sat down and you just barfed out 50,000 words, or whether you outlined it to death and then wrote the 50,000 words, you still have to do some kind of reckoning at the end of it and be able to go through again and look for these things. Because even if you outlined it to death, guaranteed your first draft, you're missing stuff.
Sure. Yeah, of course. But I do have a bit of an unpopular opinion.
You?
I think that pantsers don't exist. I think at some point you are a pantser, but then once you develop your craft, you just aren't anymore. I mean, I know you guys talked about Stephen King, and he's Stephen King. He does whatever he wants.
Well, I mean, so I disagree, because I think that like I am an outliner, but I also, my first drafts are basically pantser drafts where I'm just kind of exploring a character and stuff. And I guarantee you there are writers out there who, everybody who completes a novel probably at some point sits down and gets the outline and stuff. I think it's a matter of definition.
But even you just said that for your second novel, you did some kind of outline before starting to write it, right?
I mean, it was so basic that it was
But it's basic. Just you're hitting, the 7 plot points?
Not even. It was really just a
beginning,
3-act
middle,
structure.
So that's what I'm saying. Like, it's still something. I remember when I wrote the first draft of Rat, and I was pantsing it, and it was a mess. You guys didn't even see that draft. The one I beta read was the second draft. Yeah, you're welcome. And I'll never do that again.
Yeah.
For every idea I have, I'm going to at least hit the 7 plot points. And go
but I
there.
think a worthy approach might be kind of a mix. So, like, whenever I start a first draft, I know how it's going to begin and I know how it's going to end.
Right.
But that's how I wrote Terromancer, and that ended up not working for me. And so when I wrote Broken Blades for NaNo, I I made a mental marker of like, here's how it begins. Here's my break into 2. Here's what I think the midpoint's going to be. Here's maybe a Dark Night of the Soul ? And then I knew how it was going to end because I always start projects knowing how it's going to end. And then I just pantsed the shit out of the middle, like out of all the little bits in between. And then I had to end up pantsing the Dark Night of the Soul too because I was like, I don't even know what to do here. Let me just put them on a ship and have a duel in a fire.
There has to be the pantsing. The point of pantsing is the discovery. You have to get into the writing at some point and let the characters do stuff. Right. And from that, you take these weird turns and they end up doing stuff, and you end up realizing the story is going in this weird direction and they're going to do these things that you didn't think of. But oh my God, isn't that so much fun? I can't wait to write these next scenes because here's where it's going. And I think all the outlining in the world will never get you there. So to your point, there's no such thing as pantsing. And I would argue it's all pantsing at some point. No matter how much you outline, you get into the story and you're going to write something you'd never thought of.
But there's no pantsing without outlining or re-outlining.
Well,
because even if you pants a draft.
Both. I don't know. I think about it as collaging and then organizing personally. So you collage in which you throw in a bunch of stuff. You write a bunch of scenes that are exploratory. You have a lot of fun with it. And then at the end of the day, you're like, okay, I have this whole big mess, this collage, and now I need to organize it, into a structure. And that is where understanding structure, I think, really helps, because you have the ability to see that you have too many scenes there, or that doesn't fit, or that is not going to pay off that. But I think that it depends on the person as well. I do believe that there are some people out there that will be natural storytellers. They will have a natural inherent understanding of beginning, middle, end, paying everything off. And I think that's what we're talking about when we say pantsers. It's just people that are able to sit down and write a story from start to finish without having to outline it. But they may have other weaknesses. If you're naturally good at structure, then your second draft may be all revolving around character development and emotional connection, which we'll talk about soon. I think people have different strengths when they sit down to write. For me, I'm interested in characters, so structure is really important.
And maybe that's really what the point is know what your strength is. If you're a pantser, then know that coming into the end of your first draft, you maybe should be doing some outlining. And if you're a strong outliner, then maybe you're coming
Let
in.
your imagination flow.
Maybe take a step back and just free write some scenes, free write some chapters.
Because you've got that in your head.
There was a really good blog post on Tor recently that was like, use your writing strengths to inform your weaknesses. It was called like one free trick. Like everybody's got one free trick. I tweeted about it, I think, a couple of weeks ago. If you just go on Tor, I'm sure you can find it. One of my strengths is theme. I can usually kind of like pull out theme a little bit as I'm going through on the first draft. And so if I am stuck, I can use theme and be like, okay, well, how can I make this scene work a little more and the pacing work a little more if I have the character think about why she's doing what she's doing just a little bit, and it can kind of give a scene the oomph that it needs to carry me through into the next part.
Right.
So I would like to talk about language a little bit and what it is that makes your work unique and different to other people's work. And I think that's something to bear in mind when you're reading through your first draft, is to have a look at your scenes and, okay, now I know what is happening in the scene. I know how the characters solve the problem and get through the gate. But what...
I can't wait to read this story, by the way.
It's the best gate story ever written. But what is the specific language and detail that I am using that makes it pop and that makes it stand out? And so I have this tiny little example from The Magicians where the beast first appears. They're all sitting in the classroom and this antagonist enters the scene. And from the main character's point of view, he is describing the antagonist, and the lines that he uses are, He circled Professor March. There was something strange about the way he moved, something too fluid about his gait. When he walked into the light, Quentin saw that he wasn't quite human, or if he had been once, he wasn't anymore. Below the cuffs of his white shirt, his hands had 3 or 4 too many fingers. So that's wonderful detail. And he uses the word, like, it would be so easy to say he walked across the stage, but he doesn't. He says he circled Professor March. And the choice of the word circled is very creepy to me. It gives the sense of this predator. And then he juxtaposes that in the next sentence by saying there's something very fluid and something very kid-like about it. So we don't know who this character is. He is very, very terrifying. And I would argue that although you could say that this is detail and polishing and whatnot, I would say that his choice of language has really helped him create who this antagonist is and why he's so terrifying to the main character. And I would say that this is stuff that was definitely not in the first draft. I would have said that he probably writing this would have written the antagonist arriving, but the details that he's picking out would have come into the second draft.
It's funny as soon as you mentioned that, I remembered that scene. And my memory lasts about an hour. So for me to remember that scene from those 3 books is really saying I can't remember anything from those stories.
It's
as soon as you said, I was like,
vivid.
oh, this is the scene where the guy shows up and there's the moths in the classroom, right? And all
yes,
that bit.
it's so vivid, so atmospheric, and it's all down to the language that he uses.
And I would agree. I would wonder what Lev Grossman wrote in the first scene or in the first draft. And I'm with you. I bet you it was not that creepy. I bet it was very sort of, A to B to C. It was very sort of structural, and the bad guy shows up and he freezes everyone, and it's very terrifying, but then it's out.
Right, because it's so good that, I mean, if he wrote that in the first draft, I would be just so
genius,
impressed. Yeah, I would be so impressed.
We'll all just stop writing now.
Yeah.
I would bet that that's detailed.
Yeah.
Okay, all this is well and good, but let's say I've got a now 60,000 word nano draft, and
I can beat
guys,
that.
like, it's not a dumpster fire. It's more like it's a small trash can fire. It's a tire fire. I'm trying to put it out, but I'm getting palpitations just thinking about the enormity of what I'm now presented with. So writing's the easy bit.
So here's the thing. We've all been there. We've all finished a draft and suddenly it's like, oh, Jesus, there's this monster in front of me. I mean, yay for finishing a draft, but this is nowhere near a book. And this is something I've struggled with, and I'm sure everyone's struggled with. But what I've found that works for me is breaking it down, because this one giant beast that you're facing is actually made up of a ton of tiny little things that you can do. So breaking it down to chapter or scene or page, it'll move you along without you focusing on this 350 page monstrosity that you're facing down.
Totally. Like, one way to do it, maybe, instead of looking at your book, like you said, as a totality and going, well, I'm going to get this second draft done in 4 months or whatever, is go like, okay, this week I'm going to tackle chapter 1, or I'm going to tackle this midpoint scene that is a problem. You're absolutely right. I've had the same daunting moment where I'm just like, I'm fucked. And then, but you just shout, you wake up, you get in there and you go, this is the task I'm going to take.
Yeah.
For the moment.
Keep it manageable.
Yeah. I think that's really a helpful.
And I mean,
way.
you've walked me through that a couple times, and again, with the
Can
outlining
you walk
and the
me through it
re-outlining.
too? Like,
So
We're all here to help.
Yeah, exactly.
We're all here to help each other.
So yeah, this last time around, I'm on draft 7 of Rat, and for weeks and weeks, I was just paralyzed with not knowing what to do. And you talked me through it, and again, I'm re-outlining it. And from that outline, I'm able to tell myself, oh, I need to do this one thing. I can focus on this one thing, check it off, then go to the next thing.
progress, always moving forward and making progress.
Yep.
But you don't have to do it all at once, because it's impossible.
And I would say don't do it all at once, because otherwise you keep going back to chapter 1, page 1, and you're going through and you're just doing the first 20 pages, the first
reread
50
my
pages.
chapter 1 so many times.
It's one of those things where you just keep moving forward. Do a pass for structure. Do a pass for characters. Do a pass for language. Do a pass for theme. Don't do, I'm going to do all 5 of these things in chapter 1, and then I'm going to do all 5. It's like, no, don't do that, because you're just going to kill yourself on chapter 1.
Yeah, just break it into things that you can digest it one meal at a time, so
Exactly.
to speak. Which also is like another, like, I think important thing is, like, you know, as AP's saying, like we've talked each other through this stuff multiple times. This is the moment, in my opinion, where like having a writer's group and having people pays off the most.
This is one of the many.
One of the many, but like this is the big one. Like, you know, you don't necessarily want a bunch of feedback when you're splashing out that first draft.
Yeah,
but
that was a mistake I made by.
Yeah. You don't want. Yeah, you want to get it all on paper, and then it's great to start getting a little bit of feedback. You know, so you're not in a vacuum all the time.
Right. And you said it before we got on mic. Take that feedback and just book it. Don't immediately
Don't react like, you know, to every little comment and like,
and start at the beginning. Take the first 10 pages, get the readers back, get the critique,
make some notes,
maybe
move
turn in
forward.
the next 10 pages, get some more notes, but keep moving forward.
So yeah, again, break it down, make it manageable. You're not alone in this. Reach out. In fact, you can reach out to us. You know, we
sitting
are
here
your
right
virtual
now.
writing group. Talk to us. I mean, some of you may have finished Camp Nano. I don't think any of us did it, right?
No.
We didn't do
No.
Camp Nano, but we did.
We do Nano every
we
year.
do
but
Nano
not
every
Camp
year. Yeah.
Nano. So tell us how that was. What are you working on? Did you finish? Are you continuing to work on it? And what are you stuck on? Tweet us at Genre Hustle. You can find us on Instagram also at Genre Hustle. Send us an email, thegenrehustle@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you and help you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.